7 years ago, I read a book that was forever going to change my life, and that book was by the incredible Phil Anderson, and it was called The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. At the time, I was a property investor that had been in the game for a while and bought about 9 or 10 investment properties. I had an underlying belief which I just couldn't find any information about. At the time, I was searching as deep and wide as I could for answers, and what I was trying to find was a method to the madness. For me, it wasn't good enough to just go, well, sometimes property prices go up, sometimes they come down, and there's no system or fundamental structure to the way that the economy runs. In my mind, I was thinking, how could investors like Warren Buffett and Ray Dalio and George Soros do so well out of investing, while so many mums and dads just literally punted and tried their luck in the stock markets and the property markets around the world? Now, it was about 2 a.m. in the morning when I finally stumbled across Phil's work, and I immediately ordered The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it was one of the more challenging books that I've ever read, and it took me almost a year to completely get through the book and then understand it properly. After reading that book, I immediately reached out to Phil Anderson and have since become friends with him and had a whole bunch of in-person catch-ups where we've talked about his experiences, the longer term cycles, the things that he learned from the great W.D. Gant as well as Fred Harrison, and the underlying structure behind the global economy. Now, in today's video, I'm going to go super deep into the 18.6-year real estate cycle, but really break it down to an Australian perspective so that you've not just got a knowledge of Phil's longer term cycle, but you've got clarity on what could be coming up next so that you can take advantage and also protect yourself and the people you care about as we move into the next stage of the global cycle. Now, effectively, the 18-year cycle has 4 key components. It's got a recovery phase, a mid-cycle slowdown phase, a boom phase, a mania phase, and then the next crisis phase. Now, if we look at the current 18.6-year cycle that we're currently in, it started back in about 2010, which was after we went through the last GFC. Obviously, the world was still super turbulent at this point, but it was the start of the new cycle and the recovery phase. We then got to the first top, which was around about 2020, and the mid-cycle phase lasted in Australia and around the world for about a year and a half, taking us through to about 2022. Now, obviously, post-COVID, so many different asset classes, including gold, some stocks, commodity prices, crypto, as well as property prices around the world have gone through an incredible phase, and we're just moving into the mania phase, or the last part of the cycle as we speak. Now, according to Phil Anderson, Akil Patel, who wrote The Secret Wealth Advantage, another incredible book about this, and Fred Harrison, who wrote The Power in the Land and Boom Bust, the top of this current cycle should be about 2026 or 2027, which I know for a lot of you is probably a little bit scary, like the first time that I saw this information, but I promise you by the end of this video and after you read these books, you'll be feeling a lot more educated and be able to make much better decisions with your accountant, your financial advisors, your family and your friends as we move through what is the scariest part of the cycle, but also a once in a 20-year buying opportunity for assets around the world. Now, before I talk about each of these 4 key phases of the cycle, I just wanted to explain the history briefly. Now, this work originally came out from a guy called Fred Harrison, but there were people looking at this well before him. And basically, Fred was a researcher over there in England, and he wrote a book called The Power in the Land as part of some studies on the UK economy. Now, what he discovered accidentally and deliberately through those studies was effectively this longer term real estate cycle that can be broken into these 4 components. But effectively, it goes from the recovery phase at the start of the cycle, and things improve a little bit, but people still feel a little bit scared. Then as things are getting really good, it comes back a bit. Then people sort of go, well, that wasn't too bad. Let's go for another run. And effectively, as humans who, for most of us, we have no off switch, drive ourselves into a bit of a bubble, and then the bubble pops. Now, what's important about this information is Fred Harrison used this information to predict years and years in advance the 1990 to 1992 financial crisis. And then years later, just before the GFC, he published a book called Boom and Bust, calling the GFC before any person in the world was across it. Now, my friend Phil Anderson went on from Fred's work and went, well, that's really interesting from a UK perspective, but is there any correlation between the UK and the American markets? Obviously, America still, and at that time, being the largest economy in the world. Now, what Phil found through his research was the very same cycle that Fred had found in the UK, the on average 18.6 year real estate cycle, which is sometimes a bit earlier and sometimes a bit later, that had been literally running for hundreds of years in the US. Now, Phil, like Fred, before the GFC came out, started to tell everybody that would listen, which was almost absolutely nobody in the world, that we're coming into a GFC and that would represent hardship for some people, but an incredible opportunity for others. And then recently, Phil's business partner and a professor at Oxford University, Akil, wrote The Secret Wealth Advantage, which I highly recommend you get yourselves onto in the next 12 months. Looking at this longer term cycle, breaking it into different pieces, telling you when to sort of go a little bit harder and which asset classes work at different times throughout the cycle, and when to pull back and be a little bit safer. Incredibly good reading. And if you haven't already signed up to Akil and Phil's work over there, which you can subscribe to over at Property Share Market Economics, it has been my absolute guide for the last 7 years. They told me about the mid-cycle slowdown years before 2020 came through so that I could take advantage of that, and I'll share some stories about what happened at that particular time as we get there later on in the video. Now, if we look at the cycle and we break it into a series of pieces, the start of the new cycle is called the recovery phase. Now, from what I've seen personally and from talking to Phil and Akil, effectively, this is when the global economy and the banks have kind of got their houses in order a little bit. The damage from the previous cycle or the previous crisis point is kind of being washed away, and the banks are starting to lend again, and we're trying to reboot the system. Now, generally at this particular phase of the cycle, the recovery phase, it lasts for about 7 years. And this is when we start to see the stock market begin to improve again. This is when we see the likes of the biggest cities around the world, like the New Yorks, the LAs, the Hong Kongs, the Beijings, the Sydneys, and the Melbournes begin to recover. And that's because the governments around the world start doing two things. They start lending more money and making money way easier to access, and they also start making money really cheap. Now, I actually finished uni in the last GFC at the end of 2009, and by 2011, I was earning $55,000 a year working with IBM. Now, I know this is crazy to say, but as a 24-year-old, I had no idea, because I was at uni and working part-time in a bar, cleaning rooms, and at Centrelink, that we'd even really been through a massive GFC. But obviously for a lot of people, they'd been seriously banged up in Australia and overseas. Now, the reason I share that story is because at the start of the recovery, when they were lending money and they were making money really cheap, I got into my first property, which was a 2-bedroom unit in a suburb called Miranda on the south side of Sydney. Now, later that year in 2011, I also bought a 5-bedroom house on the central coast of New South Wales for just $213,000. Now, what was interesting for me at the time is that so many other people, especially the older people in my life, were like, what are you doing? We've just lost 50% of the value of our stocks. Nothing's happened in property for a long time, and the media says it's going to get worse before it gets better. But because I was younger, because I was looking at a 30 to 40 year time horizon, not what was going to happen in the next 12 months, and because I was ready to go, I picked up those 2 properties. Now, what was really weird is that when I went around and started to look at properties, I was literally the only person at any of the Central Coast, Wollongong, or Sydney properties for anything that I looked at for that entire year. There was absolutely nobody around, and that's why I was able to pick up both of those properties for such incredible prices. Now, once the world starts to recover and things start to get back on their feet and people start to wash away the previous cycle from their living memory, and new investors like myself in 2011 that aren't afraid and had no idea what really happened start coming back into the market, we do what we do as humans, which is blow stuff up to the point where the reserve banks, the major banks, and the government effectively go, handbrake on. And the reason that they do this is to curb the growth a little bit so we just don't end up in this crazy speculation with a monster bubble globally. Now, the thing about the reserve banks, the governments, and the major banks around the world is they've got hundreds of years worth of experiences to draw on, and there's incredible books like that one from Ray Dalio called Big Debt Crises. So there's guides on how to respond to these things, and the banks and the central governments, as well as the reserve banks around the world, are getting much, much better at responding to them faster. Now, generally in this mid-cycle point, it's effectively where we have the first pullback, and historically this has generally lasted for about 9 to 18 months, but because COVID was so brutal, it kind of extended for about 24 months. Now, in the past, this mid-cycle slowdown, just for your historical reference, is been called COVID, 9/11, or the dot-com boom and bust, the 1980s recession that we had to have when interest rates, like you've heard your parents or grandparents talk about, when they went up to 15 to 20%, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But effectively, what triggers this event is things are going well, and then something catastrophic and intense globally happens, and it triggers people into fear. And as a result of that, the market goes, hang on, maybe we are overpriced right now, and maybe this feels like the last GFC or Great Depression we went through, and let's just pull things back. And effectively, the banks around the world stop lending as much money, the price of money might start to go up, and things generally go down a little bit for a period of time. Now, later on in the video, I'll go through what happens with property and stocks over the course of the entire cycle based on Phil Anderson's analysis. But if we look at the mid-cycle point, from a property perspective, globally or in Australia, we normally see the value of properties go down around about 10 to 15% during that particular period of time, which is kind of what we saw in the likes of Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane during COVID. Now, what I think scares people even more than that is the decline that we see in the stock market over the same period. Now, based on all of these previous cycles, we've generally seen the value of stocks come down by around about 25 to about 45%. And we saw that again in COVID, where even the likes of Disney, Apple, Tesla, CBA Bank, Macquarie Bank had gone from their almost all-time highs down to a point where they'd all cut between 25 and 60% off their stock price. Now, for those people in the market with cash, with good advisors, and in a strong financial position, it represents basically a once in a 10-year buying opportunity. We've helped over 1,000 clients as a buyer's agent buy over $550 million worth of investment property in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane over the last 10 years since 2015. And this particular time was very, very scary. In fact, we were the only people walking around the Brisbane market buying property for around about 6 to 9 months. And so it does represent an incredible opportunity, but only for people in great positions that can sort of stomach that and that love grabbing a bargain. Now, I was lucky enough during this particular point in time to pick up around about 4 or 5 investment properties up here in Queensland. And I'll explain why I chose the Queensland market at this stage of the cycle versus the Sydney or Melbourne, and when the right time to buy the likes of Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth are over the course of the longer term cycle and the new cycle that we'll go through in the next 20 years. Now, once we invariably recover from the mid-cycle slowdown and people go, oh, that wasn't nice, and obviously COVID was so horrible for so many different reasons, as was 9/11, as was the 1980s recession, but generally the markets around the world figure things out and they start pumping money into the economy. Now, according to Ray Dalio's research in his Big Debt Crises book, he effectively says the way out of these financial events is generally through one of 4 things. And we saw all 4 of these in Australia to get us out of the COVID market and around the world. Now, the first one is they generally start dropping what they call helicopter money. Now, you saw that in Australia where heaps of individuals got up to $700 per week paid out from the government, and businesses got a whole bunch of grants and bailouts as well. The second thing that Ray says is important is a massive return to infrastructure spending, which has been a big part of Trump's campaign in terms of rebuilding America's infrastructure, which has also been happening in Australia with the COVID infrastructure bailout program, where we've seen literally tens of billions of dollars spent on infrastructure around the country since COVID. On top of this, Ray recommends that they make money cheaper and easier to access, which we also saw during this time, where rates got as low as 2 to 3% in Australia. And then on top of that, making money easier to access, which they're also returning to do. So from around about 2015-16 in Australia, when the Royal Banking Commission went through and APRA stepped in to make accessing money much, much harder, we're finally at the point now where they're beginning to roll back and relax some of the stuff, which is why we're seeing so much more personal lending, serviceability going up, as well as trust lending, as well as self-managed super fund lending at the moment. Now, during this boom phase, as we come out of the mid-cycle, things slowly start to gain momentum. And we've seen that in the likes of Hobart, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Sydney, and so many of the regional markets around the country, like the Sunny Coast, the Goldies, the Wollongongs, the Newcastles, the Geelongs and the Mornington Peninsulas, as we've moved out of COVID and people have flocked from the cities into those high quality lifestyle locations. Now, what happens, as we know as human beings, is momentum creates momentum. And you've seen it in the last few years in the likes of the Brisbane, the Adelaide and the Perth markets. So generally we see one or two of those markets get about a 10% growth year and everyone goes, well, I wouldn't mind a little piece of that. And then we see a 15 or a 20% growth year, and the people that have missed out on that early growth come flocking in, and we see this more and more and more as we go through the cycle. Now, this isn't just property where this happens. It happens in the stock market, it happens in gold, and it happens in the crypto market like we've seen. And if you think objectively about those markets, gold has gone up by almost 45% a year for the last 2 years. Crypto has gone absolutely off its head, and real estate prices around the world, as well as in many of Australia's markets, have gone absolutely ballistic. Now, the important thing to note as a homeowner or an investor is when you buy here, the rising tide lifts all of the boats. But if you are thinking about buying in this particular phase of the cycle, then it's not good enough to go, well, a place went up in Perth by 50% last year, I'm just going to jump on that one and hope that it works out again. You have to be much more strategic with your research. You also have to be much more conservative, because the upside and the downside are equally weighted at this particular phase of the cycle. Now, what I've personally done for myself and my clients to combat this particular phase of the cycle is I've worked with a coder from London who's a friend of mine, and he's helped me create a spreadsheet where I can literally look at over 62,000 pieces of data every single day in real time from the top 19 markets around Australia, and every single suburb within those markets within 60 k's of the CBD. Now, on a daily basis, when I can look at over 4,000 suburbs across Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or Adelaide or Brisbane, is what I realize is that some markets are massively or fully priced in and overvalued right now, and other markets like some of the suburbs in Brisbane and in Melbourne look extremely good moving forward. And so instead of choosing the suburb that's doubled in the last 10 years, maybe at this time of the cycle, you want to pick the suburbs that have only done 4 to 6% to protect yourself and make sure that you have medium-term upside on the investment that you pick up. Now, like everything in life, there is positive and negative, there is up and down, there is light and darkness, and it's the exact same thing that happens in markets around the world. They get to a point where there's not a huge amount of value left unless you know exactly where to look, and the markets go, shit, we've been going up now for about the last 14 years and it's time for a reset, which leads us into the final stage of the real estate cycle, and that is the crisis or the crash phase. Now, events in the past that you may have heard of or would definitely have heard of are things like the GFC or the Great Depression, and this effectively is a little bit different than the mid-cycle slowdown. So what happens at the mid-cycle point when things come down is there's enough buffer and money in the economy and the old assets are being cleared away that the governments and banks around the world can bail ourselves out or print enough money to sort out the system, which obviously results in what we've seen, which is higher inflation in the second half. But when we get to this point, we know right now that many of the banks around the world are very leveraged. We know that there's dodgy loans getting written at this stage of the cycle, like you can see in The Big Short. We know that people are getting more and more and more speculative, and there's more and more teenage and 20-year-old millionaires than at any other point in the cycle right now globally because of the likes of gold, stocks, and crypto in the last 10 years. And we absolutely know for a fact that the governments around the world right now are completely bankrupt, if not in massive amounts of debt. And so when we get to this crisis point, it's not as easy as just printing more money or building more infrastructure or bailing more banks out. And the governments around the world simply don't have the financial resources because of their debt positions to go in and save everyone. And so they allow the system to bleed longer. Now, don't get me wrong, they try and increase and decrease rates. They try and lend more money, but at some point the system just goes and we get to this crisis point. Now, I'm going to talk about two things now. One is the American version, where a lot of this research from Phil Anderson comes from in his book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. And then there's the Australian perspective as well, which is really important and very, very different because of the differences between the way that we run our countries and our banking systems at the moment. Now, from a stock perspective, all of the stocks around the world pretty much follow the same trend during this time, and it is a heavy trend down. Now, in previous cycles, we've seen the stock prices drop by as much as 35 to 65% depending on the stocks that you buy, but no stocks in the market are bulletproof and avoid this downturn, as we saw with even the best and the bluest chip stocks in the world getting smashed during COVID. Now, for a lot of the investors that have bought stocks good prices or good times during the cycle, they end up just dollar cost averaging it out, moving through the cycle and picking up things as they're going down in value. But the problem with fear and uncertainty and periods like this that are prolonged and a bit darker on the financial system is a lot of people pick up things at the very, very top, and then as things start going down, they get out of them, especially when they stay down for a longer period of time than they used to, or their living memory shows. Now, obviously, this is a scary phase for stock traders or people with a huge amount of stocks in their super funds. So it's a great idea to take to your accountant or your financial advisors, or to go and read those books and just see what's right for your personal position. An example of this was I found out 18 months to 2 years before the mid-cycle slowdown or COVID was going to happen, that it was going to happen. I got my mum in her stock portfolio to go into cash. She basically got out very, very close to the top. We waited for the market to go down, and then she put that money back into the market and effectively doubled it very, very quickly as we recovered from the mid-cycle slowdown. Now, I'm not a financial planner. I'm certainly not encouraging anyone to go out there and sell stuff, but that's what my mum did during that particular phase of the cycle. Now, when I talk to the likes of Phil and Akil, or most of the investors globally that we work with that understand this cycle well, a lot of them are going into a position where they're stacking a little bit of money on the side so that they can take advantage of the buying conditions that will come up in the not too distant future from now. Now, from an Australian property perspective, we are so lucky that the banks are so responsible with their lending, and as a result of that, our system still gets absolutely smashed, don't get me wrong, and it's still very, very scary. But on average, the properties in Sydney and Melbourne only end up going down on average, based on Phil's work, over the last 60 years or the last 3 crises or declining parts of the cycle, by 8%. And in the other markets like your Brisbane's and your Perth, the sort of second satellite cities, we generally see prices go down by about 12% based on the last 3 cycles or down periods of those cycles. Now, unfortunately for America, they get burnt way harder. Now, in every single cycle, there's different markets, there's different winners and there's different losers. But based on history and the last 200 years of Phil's work, we generally see house prices in America go down by as much as 15 to 35%. Now, what's important to remember is we are not one market in Australia or one market in America. We are a whole bunch of different states, territories, capital cities, markets within those cities and suburbs. And as a result of that, there were markets in America that only went down 5 or 10% during the last GFC. And there are actually markets in Australia that went up in the last GFC, like Melbourne. But on average, because there's so much fear and uncertainty in the market, and at some point the banks go, shit, we're over leveraged, we've got to get rid of all of this junk on our books before we start lending money, we get to a place where the market sits itself and sort of gets stuck for a little while before it can offload all of the bad stuff that they've accumulated over a full cycle, rebalance their books, and start lending out to everyone else again. Now, talking to Phil Anderson, the author of The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, in terms of his preparation for the last cycle, he got all of the money that he possibly could and basically was waiting in Melbourne to go out there and buy a whole bunch of stuff cheap. Now, what Phil said, even as the author of this book and having looked at hundreds of years of history, Melbourne completely bucked the trend, and over the period of the declining phase and the recovery phase of the new cycle went up by over 70%. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about personally for the last 7 or 8 years that I've understood this cycle, and I've been reading the work from these guys and I've been catching up with them for a bit, is, well, what do I do? And this is something that you probably, if this is the first time looking at this, or maybe you've looked at it before, but you're starting to go, well, these dates are getting a little bit closer than when Ben was talking about this stuff 5 years ago. Do we sell our properties and do we wait for a crash? Or do we hold those properties and do nothing? Or do we just sit on our hands, put our heads in the sand and just wait for everything to blow through and for it to all be good again? Now, for me personally, and my position is got nothing to do with yours, but I am accumulating some cash because I know stocks will be on sale, and you know I'm a property guy, but I love the idea of buying like Disney or Apple at 50 cents in the dollar. And personally, because I know not just the global picture or the Australian one, but because I've analysed over 4,222 suburbs, I can see exactly which ones are undervalued, and I know the history of the cycle and which markets do better during this phase and the recovery phase. I'll be personally looking to buy a number of properties this year in Melbourne, and that will be my primary focus personally for the next few years as we go through the next phase of this cycle. Now, I know I've probably scared the absolute shit out of you today, and that's a good thing, because it's important to understand things that are new. It's important to figure out where you sit on this stuff. It's important to read the books that I mentioned, like The Power in the Land, like Boom Bust, like The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, like The Secret Wealth Advantage, and get yourself educated so that you can not just survive through whichever way the wind blows in the future, but you can thrive through it and make much better financial decisions for yourself and the people that you care about. Now, what's important now, because I know I've been a little bit whoa on the dark side of this video, which is probably why I chucked a black shirt on compared to the white one I was wearing in the last video, but is to look at what happens over the course of a cycle on average from stocks and property in Australia. Now, one of the greatest things that Phil Anderson and I talked about last time we caught up in the Gold Coast together for dinner and a beer was what had happened from Australian perspective over the last 60 years. Now, Phil looked at the 14 years up and the 2 to sort of 4 year recovery down period and broke it into each capital city in Australia. Now, what Phil found is that for houses in Australia's metro markets, they, over the course of a cycle, had gone up on average by about 127% plus. Now, it's much easier to find data on the stock markets, obviously, because so much of that stuff in the ASX and the S&P and the NASDAQ has been tracked and is so readily accessible on Google. I've just cooked that, guys, with my little drawing here, so I'm just going to rub that one out. And what I was trying to say for the 4th time is that stocks over that longer term real estate cycle had generally done over 150% plus, with some previous cycles doing as much as 200 to 300% over the cycle. So again, I know a lot of people can sort of see this stuff, like myself, who's super conservative, has a tendency to be critical and get hyper fixated on these periods of the longer term cycle, which represent on average between about 3 to 5 years of an entire 18.6 year cycle. And we miss the incredible opportunities on the way up or the incredible buying opportunities on the way down. So I think the positives of being an investor, even though we know sometimes it absolutely sucks, are absolutely worth it, because we know we can't save our way to financial freedom. We know we have to choose one of the forms of poison, which could be business for yourself, stocks, commodities, gold, property, crypto, but at some point, bonds, you need to choose an asset class, you need to become a specialist in that asset class, and you need to learn how to maneuver and make your way through the market during the upsides and the downsides of these longer term markets. Now, the last thing that I wanted to finalize the video on, which is exactly what I talked about at the start, is, well, which markets in Australia do well at different stages of the cycle based on history. Now, from my observation of the cycle and looking at 50 years worth of data in Australia and overlaying the longer term cycles, the Sydney and the Melbourne markets generally do much better during the first recovery phase of the cycle. And that's because they have bigger populations, the government focuses on fixing those capital cities first, and because of the diversity in the economies, they generally bounce back faster. But then in the second half of the cycle, when these markets get too expensive, and we've gone through a period where people are like, this isn't really working for me, paying $2 million for a house 30Ks in the CBD of Sydney right now, they start looking at more affordable markets. And as commodities generally boom during the second half of the cycle and mining does well, because construction around the world is going absolutely off and they need the stuff under the ground in Australia, you see the likes of the Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide markets, as well as the secondary regional markets like your Townsvilles, like your Darwins, like your Wollongongs, like your Newcastles, like your Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, benefit from affordable prices. And by the end of the cycles, these markets, as we're beginning to see, become some of Australia's most expensive. And then we go all the way back around, which is what we're starting to see now, where the likes of Melbourne is starting to look really good because of all of those people that rushed out after COVID. Now, it's important to note that averages don't tell the entire story. Now, I was talking to a bank manager at CBA way back in 2013, and I used to go and have like a cup of tea with her. I can't believe she did this with me every single week for almost a year, even though I couldn't borrow money. Now, what she said to me is that property prices from about here to here in the previous cycle before the last GFC on the Sunshine Coast doubled in value, which is exactly what's happened this cycle. Now, when the water drained away and people realized that there was way too many holiday homes on the Sunshine Coast before the last GFC, and people living in Sydney and Melbourne and all around Australia or the world that had bought their little piece of the sunny coast in a place like Noosa, they effectively had a decision to make, which was, do we keep our family home and sell the holiday home, or do we go under? And I'm talking about the small percentage of people that are over leveraged at that time, that don't understand this sort of stuff, and that do the wrong thing by not buying the right market that's affordable and putting themselves in a safer position to take advantage of that. Now, what she said to me is that 1 in 3 properties in Noosa between about 2009 and 2011 were sold by the bank as mortgagee in possession, and properties on the water up there that were selling for $3 million in 2007 were now selling in 2011 and 12 for as low as $600,000. Now, another real estate agent that I follow on the Sunshine Coast, who's helped me sell a bunch of my properties personally, said to me she had no understanding of this cycle and was in real estate and thought the show would go on forever, which everyone does. They just think it will keep getting better and better and better, like we're seeing in gold and crypto and certain things at the moment. And she effectively bought this house at the very top of the cycle on a road called Oceanic Drive for $1.8 million. Now, obviously her real estate business declined because for a period of time, people were scared and they weren't coming to her. And the coast had done so well during the 7 or 8 years before that point that she ended up not being able to find a buyer. And she had to make the choice that so many people that don't understand this stuff do have to make around the world at that time. And she decided to sell the property to sort of make sure she was okay financially. And she sold it for $1 million less than she bought it for, or 800K. So for this particular time, the averages are only 8 to 12% in the capital cities, but there will be a small number of distressed people that are forced to sell because it's like save our family home or our business or our lifestyle and sell this cheaper, or, you know, continue to hold it and potentially go under in the future. And what that resulted in, or will result in next time this all washes through, is when nobody's looking in the market like they weren't in COVID, and money's a little bit harder, so not everybody can go get money. And because the herd is running in the opposite direction and selling stuff and freaking out and thinking that it's different than the past and it's never going to change, it represents incredible buying opportunities for the likes of you guys who are aware of this now years in advance, and people like myself who have a deep understanding of the cycle and personal access to the absolute legends like Phil and Akil, who are lucky enough to share their time and their education and their ideas with me so that I can bring them to you guys and help you guys make better decisions for yourself and for your families moving forward. So that's sort of it. I've almost lost my voice talking so much about this today, but this is something that I'm so passionate about. Effectively, this is the 18.6 year cycle, and in a nutshell, there's 4 key components. There's the recovery, the mid-cycle slowdown, the boom, and then the next crisis or GFC. And this has been rolling in Europe for over 300 years. There's people looking at this over 500 years ago in France and history of that in written records. It's been happening in America since effectively America first kicked off and there was no land still available. Certain cycles have been worse than others, but at the end of the day, there is incredible opportunity all the way through the cycle, and it really just depends on how much you know and your education level. I would highly, highly, highly recommend Akil's new book, The Secret Wealth Advantage. It goes into so much more detail than this. I've really just summarized my limited understanding of this cycle and what I do for myself and my family, but this book goes into each of these times in the cycle, plus many more, which assets go up in value, which ones go down, when you should be leveraging up, when you should be taking a more conservative approach, and it will give you a great analysis of history and a bit of a roadmap so that yourself, your children, and your grandchildren can take advantage of the market, because at the end of the day, no matter what you're investing in, it is all for the same reason. And for me and for you guys, that's about creating a life of financial freedom, financial peace, and financial security so that you can look after yourself and look after the people you care about. And hopefully on your journey to financial freedom, and when you actually are financially free and financially secure, you use those incredible gifts that you've been born with to go out and help other people, to educate other people, inspire other people to be kind and to live the best life possible. But at the end of the day, I wish you all the best. I'm super excited. It's 2025 at the time of recording this. I'm going out there and buying a couple of properties in Melbourne at the moment. I've really enjoyed learning about this cycle, and as bad as it is to say, there is going to be plenty of opportunity during the upsides of your future and the downsides, and it's just about getting educated and safely looking at your own position with your own advisors and going, should I just sit on the sidelines for a while and wait? Or maybe I'm in a strong enough and safe enough position to take advantage of opportunities as they come up. But either way, I wish you all the absolute best. G'day guys, my name's Ben and I'm the director here at Pumped on Property, and I just want to say a massive thank you for watching our content today. Now, if you're thinking about buying an investment property in the next 3 to 12 months, then the team and I would love to offer you a one-on-one strategy session. In that session, we can talk about exactly where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term, and we can deeply educate you on the Australian market. And then you can take that information and go and absolutely smash it on your own, or potentially become one of the small number of clients that we work with each week. To book your session, all you have to do is go to www.pumpedonproperty.com and click that book your free strategy session button. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey as an investor to financial freedom.